You can never win every game, but if you understand the 3 fundamental laws of good pickleball strategy, you'll be giving yourself your best chance to do so every single time. So today's all about what these laws are and how to execute them to the highest level. So the first law that we need to keep in mind is that when your team is up and the other team is back, your primary goal should be to keep them back and prevent them from coming forward. So this is what you need to think about when you're the player that's returning right after you run in after your return. So after you hit your return, you should always run straight to the kitchen to meet your partner up here. So you'll be starting the point up, your opponents are back, and you do not want them to come in. So what you don't want to do is hit them a nice easy shot off their third where they can move in and be aggressive like that. You also don't want to be reckless. So what I mean by reckless is, let's say I get a mid-height ball that's around the height of the net. I don't want to hit this ball as hard as I can because maybe there's a 15% chance it'll go in, but there's a high chance I'm going to miss that shot. So based off of what kind of a third shot my opponent hits, I have about a split second to make the best decision, to make the smartest play with what I have. So you're not always going to have a great opportunity, but when you do, you want to take advantage of it. And when you don't, you want to do as much as you possibly can. So this starts with targets. So where you're aiming the ball. And if you look at Drew, I have targets out to his side. So if you look at the targets that are farther in the court, when your opponent is back, or when your opponent's anywhere on the court, you want to aim at the depth of their feet out to their side. So if Drew's closer to the baseline, my best targets are the farther back targets. If he starts to move in though, maybe I didn't hit the best shot off his third, my targets move in with him. So this doesn't apply just to the 4th shot, it applies to my 6th shot and the whole rally as he's trying to move forward. So if he's here, maybe I'm going to try to go for slower balls that land in front of him. So regardless of where you are in the point, whether you're hitting it off their 3rd shot or their next shot, you're going to try to aim for the targets that are at the depth of their feet. And this applies to both sides. We only have 2 people here, so we're just doing this half court. But if Drew is back, I'm going to go towards the deeper target at his feet. As he starts to move forward though, I might need to slow things down a little bit and go for this target. Because if I go for the deep target in this situation, Drew's gonna actually be able to take it out of the air. So if I'm going deeper, Drew has an easier shot. So that's why we're at the depth of the feet and we're not always going deep. The other thing to keep in mind is if your opponent hits a really good 3rd shot, they might run straight in. And if they're doing that, you need to make sure that you hit the ball shorter and lower so that they can't intercept the ball out of the air. So if Drew hits a good drive and it's super low, I need to make sure that the ball lands in front of him like that. What I don't want to happen is go deep to where he can hit an aggressive volley. So if he goes for a drive and I hit it too deep, he can close or crash, as we call it, and take advantage of the point and take control. So you have to be very aware of where your opponent is and the shot that they just hit so that you can make the best decision in terms of your targets. Your targets are going to stay the same regardless of what shot your opponent hits, but where things are going to differ is your power. So depending on the shot they hit, you're going to go for a different type of ball from this position. So if Drew's going for a drop and I'm hitting it from mid-height, generally you go for what's called the roll volley. So here, I might not have the best angle over the net, so I can't always hit the ball super hard. But what I can do is use more spin. So what the spin does is when it bounces, it accelerates towards your opponent and it might cause them to pop it up like Drew just did, or they might just miss. So if your opponent goes for a drop, using a spinny roll is your best bet to get them to mess up. So if you don't know the technique, all I'm doing is brushing up the back of the ball with my wrist. So a lot of the time I'm leaning over the kitchen and I'm brushing up the back of the ball with my wrist, aiming for those targets as they're coming forward. So if Drew's further back, I can hit these pretty hard. I can go for those deeper targets. If he's closer, I might need to hit this really slowly, but that spin is where I get that advantage because even though the ball is not traveling that fast, the bounce is going to be super erratic because of that top spin, so I can use it to my advantage. The other situation that you need to be aware of is if your opponent is hitting a drive. So a lot of players, especially bangers as we call them, go for a lot of drives from the back of the court. Here, you don't want to go for spin because if you do, you might miss-hit the ball and miss the sweet spot and hit it short or miss in the net. So this is what I like to do when my opponents hit really hard. I go for more of a tennis volley where I'm just blocking it with a firm wrist. So you don't want to have a loose wrist here like you do on your roll. You want to block it towards the targets we talked about with a nice firm wrist the same targets. You're always aiming for those same targets. That's how you're gonna keep your opponent's back. So what you don't want to happen, which happens a lot, I'm sure it's happened to you, is where your opponent hits a drive and you sort of pop it up so they can move forward and crush you like Drew just did to me. So you wanna keep those blocks nice and low so that they can't move in. And this is where you really need to keep in mind that they might be moving forward. So you might need to aim a little shorter. You definitely need to aim lower so that they can't make it in. So those are the two formulas I generally like to follow, whether your opponent is dropping or driving. I always want to go for those targets. But occasionally, you can actually just hit the ball super hard. So if Drew goes for a drop, maybe sometimes I don't have necessarily the best opportunity to go hard, but I can accelerate because if my opponent doesn't have the best resets, I might just be able to take control. So I'm still in the advantageous position, even if they hit a good drop. So sometimes you can pull out an acceleration like I just did there, and that might be your best bet. It also keeps your opponent from getting used to your strategy. So don't do this every point, but every so often you see a lot of pros doing this, just attack the ball, even if your opponent's hit a good drop, and you could surprise them and get a free point as a result of it. So if you follow that formula to a T, you're gonna be giving yourself your best shot to keep your opponents back in the court. But if you watch pro pickleball or you play pickleball at a high level, you know that your opponents are gonna be good enough eventually to make it in. Because if they hit a good drop or a good drive and they're gonna come in, sometimes your best bet is to surrender to the dinking situation. So if I was to go for an aggressive shot there, Drew might just counterattack and beat me. So this is where we come to our dinking rallies, where we get into counterattacks, speed ups, and all that good stuff. So the second law that we need to discuss is that when you get into these situations, which are inevitable if you're playing the game properly, you need to make sure that you're playing chess. And what I mean by that is you need to make sure that you're making the smartest possible decision. So when we're up here, we're not just dinking and then speeding up at random. While it looks simple, there's a lot going on here in terms of strategy that we have to talk about. So the number one thing you don't want to do up here is be reckless. So if I get shots that are low and I don't have a good angle over the net, I don't want to accelerate because as you just saw, that's where my opponents can counterattack and beat me. And if you're playing good people, they're going to be able to do this consistently. So generally, what you're looking for when you're dinking is a shot that's higher that you can accelerate on. But it's not always super easy to get that when you're playing someone that's good. In order to get your opponent to give you those higher shots that you can accelerate on, what you want to do is move them around and hit deeper, harder dinks so that they're off balance and they don't have the ability to keep the ball in the kitchen. But this isn't what I'm talking about when I say playing chess. There's two main things that I'm referring to. And the first part of playing chess in the kitchen is that based off what's working for you and what you're seeing from your opponents, you want to toggle how aggressive you're being. So what I mean by that is, let's say for instance, my opponent is super good at dinking and they never miss dinks and they're really getting me on my back foot, right? Drew's moving me around and he's taking control of me because he's so good at dinking and I'm not as confident as him. In that situation, I'm actually probably better off being a little riskier with when I go for speed ups because I want to get out of the dinking situations earlier so that I'm not letting Drew take control. On the flip side, let's say I'm winning in the dinking situations. So I'm moving Drew around and he's doing the exact opposite. He's giving me easy shots. Here I'm probably better off waiting for good opportunities to accelerate on higher shots because I'm actually creating them, right? So I don't have to be quite as reckless because I'm taking control of most of the dinking rallies and I can wait for the better balls. Another situation you want to think about is if your opponent is really good at counterattacks. So if you keep speeding up on your opponents and they just keep canceling you with good counterattacks like Drew just did, a lot of the time you might need to be a lot more careful about when you speed up. So if Drew just keeps counterattacking and winning the point of me, I might just be better off at being patient in a dinking rally and letting Drew speed up on me so that I can counterattack. Because if it's not working for me and I'm hitting good dinks, a lot of the time he might just get bored and speed up, then I can take control of the point. And on the flip side of that, if I'm speeding up at Drew and he's just not counterattacking well, that's my indication to be more aggressive and go for speed ups more often in slightly worse situations. So depending on what you're seeing, you can be a little less safe in terms of the height that you speed up the ball. So generally, if the ball is higher than the net, you should go for a speed up. I'm talking about where you make contact with the ball. If the ball is below your knee, you should almost never go for a speed up. If it's in this area, you're kind of debating based off how good your opponent is at responding to it. So that's where the decisions are really being made. But the next part of playing chess at the kitchen is deciding where to attack or where to counterattack when you do so. So when we're talking about when to attack, there's really two ways that you can attack at the kitchen. Both are speed ups, but one is an out of the air speed up where I'm doing it as a volley, and one is an off the bounce speed up where I'm doing it off the bounce. So when we're talking about out of the air speed ups, you can actually hit these from a little bit lower because you're a lot closer to your opponent. So they have less time to react. So if I'm dinking with Drew, he gives me a ball out of the air that I can speed up on. Doesn't necessarily need to be super high for me to get it to where he can't react. So if you're speeding up out of the air, it can be a slightly riskier. Off the bounce, you probably want to have a higher ball so that you can hit with a better angle. Because if you go for a speed up off the bounce and it's not very high, you're giving your opponent an easy shot like that to take advantage of. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of the time you'll see pros speeding up out of the air because of this. And when you do that, you just use that same sort of roll volley technique to still get enough power when you're really on the stretch. But the next part of this is where you're hitting the ball. So our main targets when we're at the kitchen are down the middle, at your opponent's right shoulder, and down the line. Those are the three main ones. There's some other targets you can go for too. But when we're looking at those three, when you start off a game, generally what you want to do is you want to try going for each one, and maybe you have some assumption as to what will work against certain players, but you want to try going to each one and see what works. So if I'm, dinking with Drew and I go right at his right shoulder and he misses, that's my indication to keep doing that. And the second he starts getting used to it and doing a good job of responding to it, maybe I switch to down the middle. But if something's working in terms of a target, that is where you want to speed up to and counterattack to. So you can do this player by player too. Maybe against one player, maybe it's the weaker player, they're not responding well to a certain shot. You can try to construct your dinking rallies so that all of your attacks are to that person. And that's how you can get an advantage, even when you're playing a team that might be a little bit better than you. So this is just about smart decision making and finding what's working from a standpoint of attacking at the kitchen. If you ever feel like when you're in a kitchen battle, you have no advantage ever, nothing is working for you, there's two things that I like to try. And the first is that when you're dinking, you should start trying to go for more aggressive dinks. So what I mean by more aggressive dinks are more dinks into the pressurized zone. So if you're not dinking very hard and they're really short in the kitchen, it's just really easy for your opponent to respond. But the second you start going more out to your opponent's sides, deeper in the box, maybe even a little bit past the box, that's when it starts getting harder and you can start forcing more airs from your opponent. So you can also add in some topspin dinks too. So if you watch pros, probably at least half of their dinks are hit with topspin. Usually topspin dinks are seen as your aggressive dinks, while slice dinks are seen as your more defensive dinks. So it's not always the case, but if I want Drew to mess up at the kitchen, I'm gonna aim for those same targets we talked about earlier, right at the depth of his feet out to his sides. And if I use topspin like I do on my roll volleys, I can also cause some airs at the kitchen. So if you're not seeing any advantages and your opponents aren't missing any dinks, you might want to add some extra depth, pace, and spin to them and see what happens. Another thing to consider, going cross court on aggressive dinks is generally better because you can hit them harder. So me and Drew are doing all the examples today down the line. Specifically when it comes to dinking, going cross court gives you a huge advantage because you can hit them twice as hard because you have so much more length to work with. So consider that. The other thing you can do if you're not winning your kitchen battles and it seems like they're taking control is you can start mixing it up. So what I mean by mixing it up is instead of just going for the standard dinking rallies and going for speed ups, you can start to throw in some lobs. You can start trying to Ernie if you have the athleticism to do that, and going for things that your opponents aren't expecting, just making, more different types of decisions, never speeding up into the same spot over and over again. And that's just going to keep your opponent on edge, right? And it might be the case that they're so good that you still can't win these kitchen battles, but this is what you do sort of as a last resort if nothing else is working. So you start throwing in your more aggressive dinks with topspin, maybe even some lobs. And even if it doesn't work, next time they're going to be a little more weary of what you're going to do because you're not being predictable. So in the long run, it can be a very helpful thing to try. The next thing to consider is more of an equipment hack. And it's that based off how you're doing in your dinking rallies on an ongoing basis, so not in an individual game, but based on how you're doing in your dinking rallies in general, you can actually decide what paddle choice to make. So for instance, if I'm losing a lot of dinking rallies because of my soft game, I might be better off with a paddle that has more control. And if I'm losing because I can't counterattack hard and I'm not getting enough power, I might be better off switching to a paddle that's more powerful. So I challenge you to go out and when you're playing and sort of think about where you're losing these types of rallies, and that could actually give you good evidence to what type of paddle you should switch to. So let's say I'm playing with Drew and I just keep missing my dinks. Like I'm popping them up, I'm missing them in the net, I don't feel like I have enough control. That's probably mostly technique, but you might actually give yourself a little bit more of an advantage by switching to a softer paddle. So assuming that doesn't ruin your ability to get power, you might be better off with a softer paddle. If I'm the type of player that's really good at dinking and my soft game is amazing, but I just can't seem to crack an egg, whenever Drew speeds up at me, I don't seem to be getting enough power, that's where you might want to switch to a paddle that has more power. So me personally, I like a paddle that's sort of in the middle, which is why we made the sweet spot in what I like to call the Goldilocks range. So there are paddles that are sort of in the middle of control and power, like this one, but based off your own game, everyone's different. By all means, you might be better off with a way more powerful paddle or a way more controlled paddle. And when you look at pros, Ben Johns uses a thicker paddle at 16 millimeters. One of my good friends, Roscoe, is a pro. He uses a 14 millimeter paddle. It's just based off what you feel like you need, but this is how you make the decisions. It's sort of based off what you're struggling with and what you want a little bit more power or control in. The next law we need to consider is that when you're the serving team, you essentially flip the laws from when you're the returning team. Your goal here is to try to do whatever you can to get forward so that you can get into an either neutral or advantageous position. So it starts with the serve, right? You want to go for a deep, aggressive serve so that you get a shorter return because that makes it easier. But if you don't hit a good serve and your opponents hit a deep return, they might just hit a deep return either way. In this case, your best bet when you're on defense, when you're serving, is to go for a drop. Because when you go for a drop, it makes it harder for your opponents to attack, so you can at least move forward a little bit. So in the first scenario while serving, by the way guys, we're doing these examples down the line because there's only two of us, but generally you're obviously serving cross court. So when I'm the serving player and my opponent hits a nice deep return, my best bet here is to drop and sort of start inching forward based on how good my drop is. So if my drop is very good, I want to go straight to the kitchen. If my drop is just okay and Drew has a mid-height volley, I'm going to probably go to about right here to where I can do a reset. And if my drop is bad and Drew has an easy shot he can attack, I'm going to stay back. So there I'll defend and try to hit a better drop on the next one so that I can start moving forward. On the flip side, if Drew hits a bad return that's short and high, so a good return is deep, a bad return is high and short. If Drew hits a short and high return, here I'm better off driving so that I can attack and move forward. So the scenarios change a lot depending on what your opponents do. If your opponents are good, generally though, they're going to be able to hit a pretty decent return. So you're going to want to favor your drop in that situation. So just like when you're at the kitchen, you base your decision making off what your opponent is giving you. And within that though, there are some cool ways that you can get advantages. So if I can push Drew back really far on my serve and he's getting in slowly, here I might actually be able to go for what I call a hybrid third, which is essentially a mixture between a drive and a drop. And it's very difficult for him because it's coming low at his feet as he's moving forward, but that also lets me move in. So what I'm getting at is that you want to take advantage of whatever you can when you're the serving team. When you're the serving team, you have a big disadvantage. So if your opponent hits you a really high ball, you want to be aggressive. If they're getting in slowly, you want to try to go at their feet as they're moving forward. A lot of the time though, you're gonna be in a bad situation where you just need to drop and battle from farther back. Another way that you can get an advantage though when you're back is if your opponent is not responding well to you being aggressive. So if I'm hitting a bunch of drives and Drew's just not doing very well with them and it's letting me move forward, then I can choose to be more aggressive in situations where I normally wouldn't. So on the flip side, if I'm going hard against my opponent and they're making every single volley back super deep right at my feet, there I'm probably better off going for drops so that I can move forward in a more structured way. But especially at the lower levels, 3.0 to 4.0, if you're going for drives and it's working, you might as well keep doing it because it's actually a little bit easier to make drives in than drops. So this might be a more consistent game style. And that's why bangers do so well at the lower levels. So just like we're playing chess at the kitchen, we're playing chess back here because we're assessing what our opponents are doing well with and we're responding accordingly. So even really good players sometimes will just be having an off day with their reactions, and they might give you shorter balls that you can be aggressive on and move forward. So you need to make those kinds of assessments, and every game, it's going to be different against every player that you play. In terms of other ways you can get an advantage, there's some best practices in terms of where you aim the shots based on whether you're hitting a drop or a drive. So if I'm hitting a drop, one of the best things that you can do is go to your opponent's backhand, because here most players aren't quite as good as being aggressive. So if I'm going to my opponent's forehand, they might really like accelerating off of that. So I'm assessing when I'm playing people what they're good at being aggressive off, and I'm going to try to go towards their weaknesses. Another thing you can do on the drop or the drive is go down the middle, because when you go down the middle, you might just confuse your opponents as to which one of them is going to take it. So this applies to pretty much any shot, even when you're at the kitchen too. But by going down the middle, whether it be a drop or a drive, it's a good way to mess your opponents up. It's also limiting the risk that you miss wide. So going down the middle, probably the number one place to aim on a third shot. And the last place that you can aim when you're hitting a third shot is if you see a gap. So let's say you see that your opponents are randomly shifted over, which happens sometimes. You can either drive there and try to go for a winner, or you can drop there and try to get your opponent off balance. So if I see Drew shifted more towards the center for whatever reason, I can just try going for a down the line drive like that, or a drop to get him off balance. And if I hit a good third shot, the next thing you want to keep in mind is that if you can crash, which means run immediately to the kitchen, this can be a very smart play if you get a high ball from your opponent. So whenever I hit a really good third and I see that either I hit a low drive or my opponent is off balance from my drop, what I try to do is crash in so that I can be aggressive on that next shot. So to show you what that looks like, on a drop, let's say I get Drew out wide and I see he's a little off balance, pops the ball up, I immediately go in so that I can be aggressive. Worst case, he hits a dink and we're in a dinking rally. So there's not really much of a risk coming in there because he's not going to be aggressive. On a drive, let's say I hit a nice backhand drive that's super low and dipping, I can sort of predict that Drew's not going to hit the best shot. And even there, he didn't pop it up to where I could take it out of the air, but I can still speed up on that next shot because it was sitting up for me nicely. So you need to be extra aware of that because it's not going to happen every point, but a lot of the time you're just going to get an easy shot that you can come in and score on. So if you watch pros, as the paddles are becoming more and more powerful, you're seeing a lot of players starting to do this. You can even do the shake and bake where you cross over onto your partner's side. Regardless, you just need to be ready for any sort of floater so you can take advantage of it. And guys, the way we're able to support this channel is with our products. So if you're interested in anything that we sell, whether it be our paddle, the Sweet Spot Pro, the Dink Master, the #1 training tool in pickleball, the mini court, our new product balance pods, best way to weight your paddle, make sure to go check them out on our site. Also, this video is presented by playpickleball.com, one of the best sites to get tons of different types of information about the sport, coaches, where to play, all that good stuff. Make sure to go check that out too. But if not, this next video goes all about how to win when serving. So we only talked a little bit how to win when serving here. This video is all about the full strategy of when you're the serving player or the serving team and how you can be the most effective when you're in that position.